Snow was falling the night the eastbound train hissed into Copper Creek and left her there. The wind howled along the frozen rails like some lonely creature denied a home. Nora Wren stood beside her worn carpet bag, watching the tail lamps vanish into a swirl of white. A nurse's cap peeked from beneath her travel cloak, but the fabric was too thin for a prairie winter. Her breath came in plumes that rose and vanished quickly, as if the cold refused even that small warmth. The platform lanterns guttered, struggling against the gale. She pressed her gloved hands together, murmuring a prayer that trembled more than her voice. The benches were crusted with snow. No one else waited, no porter, no friend, no promise. She had thought she could reach the next town before dark. She had thought too many things lately. From the ticket window, the clerk muttered that the next train west wouldn't come until morning, then bolted the door behind him. That left only silence, the soft groan of timbers and the endless hush of snow. Nora moved closer to the station stove, its embers dull and mean-spirited. She crouched and rubbed her hands before it until her fingers tingled back to life. Boston seemed a lifetime ago. The hospital's marble halls, the scent of antiseptic and candle wax, the polished shoes of doctors who never bent to touch the dying. She had touched them. She had stayed her hand on one man's wrist long after he was condemned. The outlaw's eyes had been gentle in death, and when she closed them, she felt something in herself close too. Mercy had cost her everything. Her post, her reputation, her direction. The storm thickened, curling around the edges of her memory. She pulled the cloak tighter and lifted her gaze to the dark line of the road where the snow began to blur. A shape moved through it, steady as a heartbeat, horse and sleigh, the sound of runners whispering across the ice. The bells were small, reluctant to ring. The man who stepped down was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a fur-lined coat the color of night soil after rain. He didn't hurry, didn't even seem cold. Snow gathered on his hat brim, his face hidden by the low tilt of it. He walked like a man who carried his own weather inside him. "Evenin'," he said simply, his voice a gravel road smoothed by time. Nora straightened. "Evening, sir." Her voice cracked on the wind. "You waitin' on someone?" She hesitated. "Only the next train." He looked toward the empty tracks, then back at her. "That one won't sing till dawn. You'll freeze before it does. I'll manage." He said nothing more, only opened the sleigh box, drew out a tin flask, and poured steaming coffee into its lid. The aroma drifted between them, bitter and comforting. When he held it out, she accepted it with both hands, her gloves stiff with cold. The heat burned her tongue, but she drank anyway, her eyes lifting to his. They were pale, not gray, not blue, something between. Like the sky just before a snowstorm breaks. "You're not from here," he said. "No," she answered, and left it at that. He nodded, as if he understood the weight behind that single syllable. The wind rose again, lifting the hem of her cloak. He studied her shivering a long moment before he spoke. "My place is a mile down the road. Got fire and blankets. You can wait there till morning." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy as unfallen snow. "I can't impose. You'd be doing me a favor," he interrupted softly. "Been too long since anyone spoke under my roof." Something in his tone was neither kindness nor pity. Just plain truth. She searched his face for deceit and found only weariness. When she finally nodded, he helped her into the sleigh. The leather seat was cold against her legs. The horse shifted, breath clouding in the air. He flicked the reins and they moved into the storm. The ride was silent but not empty. The world narrowed to the rhythm of hooves and the hiss of snow on iron runners. Lantern lights swung in gentle arcs, painting the whiteness in gold for a heartbeat, then surrendering it again. Nora watched the man's profile. Strong jaw, a scar just visible near the temple. He caught her glance once and offered a faint smile, the kind that vanishes before it reaches the eyes. "Name's Colt Harland," he said after a while. "Nora Wren." He tipped his hat slightly. "Pretty name. Sounds like it belongs to someone who sings." "Used to," she said. When they reached his ranch, the world was buried in silver quiet. The house stood solitary against the hills, windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. Inside, warmth rolled out in waves, the smell of wood smoke and horses, old pine floors creaking under his boots. He took her cloak and hung it near the fire. "Ain't much, but it's dry." "It's everything," she whispered. She crouched near the hearth, palms extended toward the flames. The heat crawled up her arms, bringing tears to her eyes. He moved about the room, setting down supplies, tending the kettle. His presence large, but unintrusive. On the mantel sat a photograph. 2 boys, both smiling. One unmistakably him before time hardened his edges. She felt his gaze on her back and turned slightly. You live alone? He nodded. Since my brother passed. Ranch hands stay in the bunkhouse come winter. Easier that way. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. Don't be. Folks die. Land don't care who remembers. He poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from her. The clock ticked between them, its pendulum carving seconds out of silence. Nora wrapped her hands around the cup. The townsfolk, they didn't seem eager for strangers. He gave a small chuckle. Copper Creek's got more whispers than prayers. Best way to keep warm is by talking about someone colder. She smiled despite herself. Then I suppose they'll have plenty to say about me. They already do, he admitted, not unkindly. And about me too. Outside, the wind beat against the shutters. Inside, the fire hummed low, content. For a long time, they simply listened to it breathe. Later, he showed her the spare room. The bed was simple but clean, a quilt patterned with faded stars. As she undressed, she caught her reflection in the small mirror. A face thinner than she remembered, eyes dulled by travel. Yet something glimmered faintly there, as if the fire had left a spark behind. Through the thin wall, she heard Colt's footsteps pacing the main room, then the slow notes of a harmonica. The tune was mournful, drifting like snowflakes down a valley. She lay awake, letting the melody carry her, half dream, half ache. Morning came gray and soft. She found him in the kitchen, feeding logs to the stove. The smell of coffee filled the air again. Train leaves in an hour, he said quietly. She nodded, but her heart sank with the steam from her cup. You've been kind. I'll repay you somehow. He shook his head. You already did. How? You listened. The words caught her off guard. No one had said that to her before. They rode back to the station under a paling sky. The town emerged from snow like a secret half-remembered. People paused to stare. Lydia Boone sweeping her porch. Deputy Pike tipping his hat but not smiling. The gossip buzzed unspoken in their eyes. At the platform, she stepped down. The wind had calmed but the cold lingered. Colt handed her the bag, his gloved fingers brushing hers. A simple touch, small, unremarkable. And yet it carried all the warmth of the night before. I hope you find what you're after, he said. And you, she replied softly. Find what you've lost. He nodded, tipping his hat again before turning toward the sleigh. She watched him go, the shape of him fading into the pale distance until only the horse remained. Then nothing. The train whistle sounded far off, mournful as the harmonica's tune. She stood a long while before stepping toward it. Yet when the cars clattered into view, she did not move. The door of the last coach opened. Steam coiled around her boots. She looked down the road he had taken, the snow beginning to fall anew, gentle and sure. Her ticket fluttered in the wind, then slipped from her fingers. Nora Wren turned away from the train and began walking back toward the hills, toward the faint line of smoke that marked Colt Harlan's ranch. By the time the whistle faded, her footprints were already filling with snow, and in that white silence, something warm and wordless began to stir. A beginning so quiet the world almost missed it, yet strong enough to change the shape of winter itself. Winter held on longer than it should have. The hills around Copper Creek gleamed beneath the sun, but the air still bit like memory. Nora Wren walked the ranch path each morning, boots crunching through old snow, her breath steady as prayer. What began as shelter had turned into something nameless, a rhythm that neither she nor Colt Harlan dared define. He mended fences while she mended wounds. His cattle, his horses, sometimes his silence. She had turned the old parlor into a makeshift infirmary, washing linens, grinding herbs she found by the creek, tending any traveler or ranch hand who dared trust a stranger. The town watched. Some sent patients, others sent whispers. It didn't matter. A woman alone in a man's home would always give Copper Creek something to chew on. Colt rode into town once a week for supplies. Each time he returned, she saw it. The hardness around his eyes. The quiet shame of a man who had spent a life earning the wrong kind of respect. One night, as he dropped a sack of flour beside the stove, she asked softly, "What do they say about me?" He didn't look up. "Same thing they say about me. Only your half's more poetic." The fire snapped, throwing orange across the walls. "And what do you say?" "That they don't know you," he said, his tone as even as the plains outside. For a while, they lived inside that answer. The snow thinned. The creek began to whisper again. Some evenings, when the chores were done, he played his harmonica by the window, eyes half closed, the tune winding through the house like smoke. She sewed by the light, her needle catching the rhythm. They never spoke of what bound them there. It was too fragile, too sacred to name. But Copper Creek would not let peace live untested. The trouble began with riders. 2 men and a boy, who came up the trail one twilight when the light was dying gold. Their faces were half hidden under scarves, their horses lathered from speed. Nora saw Colt stiffen before they even dismounted. Harland, the older one drawled, spitting snow from his beard. Heard the hills been generous to you. Figure it's time old debts get settled. Colt's voice was low, dangerous in its calm. Ain't no debt between us, Trace. Not anymore. Reckon there is. Your brother took what was mine, land, pride, life, and you bought your comfort with the silence that followed. Nora stood in the doorway, her pulse steady only because she refused to show fear. The boy with them couldn't have been more than 16. His hands trembled on the reins. Trace's gaze slid to her. Well now, this is new. Didn't peg you for company keepin', Harland. Guess a man gets lonely with ghosts. The words struck harder than the wind. Nora felt Colt's restraint like a living thing. His jaw flexed once, then he said, You've had your say. Leave the woman be. Trace laughed, the sound brittle as breaking ice. Ain't it something that mercy runs in your house? Maybe I ought to see if she's as kind as folks claim. The world seemed to narrow around the space between them. Colt's hand hovered near his coat where a revolver still slept, untouched for years, but Nora stepped forward before he could draw. You should go, she said quietly. There's enough cold in this place without your kind adding more. For a moment, no one moved. Then Trace spat in the snow, turned his horse, and rode off with the others. The sound of hooves faded, leaving behind the sharp scent of fear. That night, Colt sat alone by the fire, hat in his hands. She bandaged a scrape on his arm from the scuffle outside. Barely a wound, but his stillness was worse than pain. You didn't have to step between us, he said. I did, she answered. You were about to bury another ghost. He looked at her, eyes hollow with old grief. You think mercy fixes men like them? No, she said, but it keeps us from becoming them. He turned away, the muscles in his jaw softening. My brother used to talk like that. Then maybe that's why you're still here to remember him. Outside, the wind moaned along the fences. Inside, something fragile but unyielding passed between them, an understanding deeper than apology. Days later, word spread through town that Trace and his men were camping near the ridge, waiting. Colt could have gone to the sheriff, but Copper Creek's law was thin as ice. Instead, he saddled his horse before dawn. Nora woke to the sound of hooves and ran to the porch. Don't go alone, she said, her voice caught in the morning mist. He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw not pride or guilt, but the quiet exhaustion of a man tired of carrying yesterday. Can't let this hang over the ranch. Or over you. Then I'm coming. He shook his head. This ain't your fight. Neither was my past, she said. Still followed me here. The argument ended when he realized she'd already fetched her coat. Together they rode out, 2 silhouettes against the paling horizon. The ridge was a hard place. Black rock, wind-cut, no trees for shelter. They found the campfire still smoking, the 3 men half awake, the boy startled enough to drop his rifle. Colt dismounted, leaving his weapon in the saddle. Trace, he said, voice level. You came for blood, but there's been enough spilled over this land. Trace rose slowly, suspicion curdling in his eyes. So what then? You hand me what's mine. Or do we finish this proper? You'll finish it one way or another, Colt said. But not by my hand. The moment teetered. Time stretched thin as a thread. Trace's hand twitched toward his belt. Nora saw the movement, her pulse leaping. The gun flashed, sound swallowed by wind. Colt staggered but stayed standing. In the confusion, the boy stumbled forward, pale and shaking, eyes wide as guilt. Trace froze when he saw the pistol slip from his own grip, landing harmless in the snow. Colt bent, picked it up, and turned it over once before tossing it aside. Go, he said quietly. Take the boy and don't come back. Trace stared at him as if the word were poison. But the boy tugged his sleeve, whispering something, and within minutes they were gone, riding hard into the distance, swallowed by snowlight. When they were alone, Colt swayed. The blood beneath his coat spread like ink. Nora caught him before he fell, lowering him to the ground. The bullet had grazed his ribs, nothing mortal, but the cold would take him if she didn't act fast. She tore her scarf, pressed it tight, speaking softly as she worked. You're not dying here, Colt Harland. Not while I've got breath, he tried to smile. Always giving mercy to outlaws. Only the ones worth saving. The snow began again, light at first, then heavy enough to blur the horizon. She half dragged, half supported him back to the horse. The ride home was a blur of motion and pain, her arms steady around him as if willing his heartbeat to match her own. By the time they reached the ranch, dawn had burned through the storm. She stitched his wound under that new light, her hands sure despite exhaustion. When he finally stirred, hours later, she was asleep in the chair beside him, cheek resting near his hand. He lifted it weakly, brushed a stray curl from her forehead, and whispered something the wind carried away. Days passed before he could stand again. The town heard fragments of the story, how the millionaire cowboy faced down old ghosts and lived. No one mentioned the nurse who rode with him, but they all came to her now. Mothers with fevered children, miners with broken hands, even Deputy Pike when his shoulder went bad. She asked for nothing, and they left payment on the windowsill, quiet and ashamed. One afternoon, as the sun thawed the last of the drifts, Colt found her behind the house, hanging linens in the wind. "You could leave now," he said. "Copper Creek's made up its mind about you." "So has the land," she replied, smiling faintly. "It keeps forgiving us, even when we don't deserve it." He took the line from her hands, his fingers brushing hers. "You ever think about where you'd go if you did leave?" "Somewhere warm," she said, eyes glinting. "But I'd still be cold without the sound of your harmonica." He didn't answer, just looked toward the hills where the snowmelt ran like silver veins through the earth. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was a promise still forming. That night, they sat by the fire again. He played softly, and she leaned against the window frame, eyes half closed. Outside, the moon turned the world to glass. They never spoke of love. They didn't have to. It lived in the way he poured her coffee before his own, in the way she set his coat by the fire before he thought to reach for it. The small mercies had become the language between them, and the ranch seemed to breathe easier for it. As spring arrived, the snow retreated from Copper Creek streets. Lydia Boone started leaving bread on their porch, and Deputy Pike stopped by for tea instead of gossip. The preacher said in his sermon that some winters end not with sun, but with forgiveness. People nodded, and when they passed Nora and Colt in town, they tipped their hats. Years later, folks still spoke of that season. The winter when a nurse came west and a cowboy learned warmth again. They said the snow that year melted slower, as if reluctant to leave the ones who taught it gentleness. And if you ever find yourself alone at a quiet station, with the wind whispering through the rails, remember them. Remember that mercy is not weakness, that love does not arrive in thunder but in the hush that follows, when two souls finally stop running from the cold. If their story warmed you tonight, then stay a while. The West still has 1,000 hearts waiting to be heard. Subscribe and we'll ride again, into another tale, another winter, another mercy worth remembering.